It's with great pleasure, truly an honor to have Sister Mara Faulkner, our speaker this evening. She's been a member of St. Benedict's Monastery since 1967 and on the St. Ben's and St. John's faculty since 1976. Mara did her doctoral work at the University of Minnesota and has published 3 books, including her most recent, Going Blind, a memoir, in which she uses her writing as a way to understand her experience of her father's blindness due to retinitis pigmentosa. Sister Mara uses this as a vantage point to approach other kinds of blindness, both physical, but also all the other ways, the rich layers of metaphor that are associated with that word. Each chapter revolves, in the book, revolves around a different manifestation of being unable to see. We read the book in our monastic refectory and thoroughly enjoyed the read for our community. She teaches American and contemporary literature, has strong interest in reading and writing the memoir, literature on working class people, as well as multicultural literature in the United States. The title of her presentation this evening is Lessons from Going Blind, Teaching and Writing in Troubled Times. Please give a warm collegial welcome to Sister Mara.
I'm happy to see you here. It's so gorgeous outside that I wasn't sure there would be anybody here at all. And I think maybe I should just send you all out to enjoy this beautiful evening. But since you're here, we'll talk a little bit. This is the book, Going Blind, that John just talked about. And I know some of you have read it and some of you haven't. And as he said, it's about my father. But one of the things that it's about is the fact that in our family, even though blindness was a daily fact of life and a disease passed on from generation to generation, including the generation I'm part of, it was a secret in our family. And that was to protect my father's, his self-respect, which if you were blind, you had to do, I think, in the 1940s and 50s, or at least he thought he had to. And so, it took me 10 years to write this book. And because there were so many secrets, I took a ton of research to find out the answers to the questions that I had. And I tell people that when I began to write it, I didn't know 90% of what I needed to know in order to put the first word on the page. And that seems like an exaggeration, but it's not. I really didn't know that 90%. And then I had the leisure to do the research to find out the answers to my questions. And I think I thought that when I got to the end of it, I would know what I needed to know. But that's not so. And so what I have developed is what I call the 90% rule, which is that the minute you think you know everything, there's 90% more that you don't know yet. And I think that's true in absolutely every area of knowledge, every field of human endeavor. And when you learn that 90%, there's another 90% out there just tantalizing you. It's either in the future or it's something that you need to know from the past. I heard the other day that geologists recently found a 30-million-year-old tropical forest fossilized in a volcano in northern China. Now think of that, a secret that has lasted 30 million years. And some smart person just discovered it. So, one of the ways in which I learned the limits of what I know was that the people who read the book began to write their own lives in the margins of it. And then they would come to me and they would either say or they would whisper some secret that their family was keeping. And they would say to me things like, well, in my family, it's not blindness, it's autism, or it's bipolar disorder, or it's my father who had only one arm and we never dared talk about it, which seems incredible, but keeping blindness a secret is incredible too. Or it's alcoholism, or it's poverty, or the most shameful of all, it's an outdoor toilet. One of the things that my sisters are never going to forgive me for is the fact that I revealed that when we were growing up, we didn't have indoor plumbing. and so we had a toilet in the back. And of course, my sister said, well, we're the only people in the world who live that way, only to find out that one person after another, people are nodding here, one person after another came up to me and said, kind of whispered, we had an outdoor toilet too. And so anyway, I learned that a lot of people have secrets, and that I was perhaps helping them tell those secrets, or at least reveal them a little bit. The cover of the handout that I gave you, which is called the Electromagnetic Spectrum, and I don't know much about this, but my nephew, who is a scientist, put me onto it. What you can see is that little tiny sliver of visible light, about a third of the way down the spectrum, that then breaks into all the colors of the rainbow. And what we humans can see with our unaided eye is that much, that little sliver right there, and that's not even 10%. But all the rest of this is really light that's visible, not to us, at least not with our unaided eyes, but to us with the aid of various kinds of scopes and so forth. So, there's all this that we can't see. We can't see X-ray, and we can't see, what else can't we see? All the stuff that's listed there. And so this has become for me, I keep it in front of me as a metaphor for all the things that we can't see in other ways. There's physical sight, and what this says is that whether you can see very well, whether you can see in the dark like a cat, or whether you're like me and can't see much at all in the dark, you and I can only see that little bit. And so we're all going blind in many areas of our life, physically, but we're also going blind emotionally and psychologically and every other way, or at least that's what I have come to believe. And I think that our language acknowledges how much we don't know. And that was one of the things that I played with in my book, playing with the phrases and words that use blind in various ways. And every one of them acknowledges that there are these whole huge areas where we don't know anything. So, for example, blind prejudice, blind faith, blind greed, blind ambition, blind dates. You know how much you don't know there, young people out there, and especially turn a blind eye. But tonight, what I thought about talking about was not physical blindness or any of the other kinds I just named, because I talked about them in my book, and I thought I would like to do something different. So I would like to talk about the kind of blindness that I think is in our human DNA, simply because we're human and we have bodies. Our bodies are not transparent or translucent; they're opaque. I don't even know if they're opaque, but anyway, we can't see through them. Is what I'm saying. And what that means is that there's so much of what is inside each of us that is not visible to anybody else unless we reveal it, unless we find a way to reveal it. As I was thinking about this, I thought that this opaqueness, like almost everything human, is both a blessing and a burden. And I was thinking about standing in front of a classroom and how terrifying it would be if I could see what all my students were thinking. I don't really want to know. I don't think I even want to know what people are thinking in this room. So the blessing is that we don't know everything that's going on in everybody's head at every moment, because we probably couldn't stand the burden. But on the other hand, if we can't name the burdens and the secrets that we carry, we have to carry them alone. And we have to carry them inside, where they often fester, like as the secret of blindness did in my family and in my father's life. So I'm asking a simple question. What does that opaqueness ask of us? And it's so simple that maybe it's obvious. And maybe there's an obvious answer for everybody but me. But that's what I would like to explore. And I'm going to try to do it through some poems that I've brought and that are in here, and then some stories, very, very brief ones that I'm going to read, because I really think through, I reason, I think, when I do reason, through poetry and stories. And so I hope that you'll be willing to go along with me in doing that. The first one, the first poem I'd like to have you look at is one that expresses this opaqueness so well, I think, and it's right on the first page of your handout, the poem Unsaid by Dana Goya. So much of what we live goes on inside. The diaries of grief, the tongue-tied aches of unacknowledged love are no less real for having passed unsaid. What we conceal is always more than what we dare confide. Think of the letters that we write our dead. It's too late, of course. So that expresses, as well as anything I know of, the kind of hiddenness that we have to each other. And to find a tentative answer to my question about what this opaqueness asks of us, I turned to teaching and writing and teaching writing, because I was thinking those are really the only things that I know anything at all about, and it's where, along with stories and poetry, where I've learned what I think I need to know to live. But what I'm hoping is that you all will fill in, and those are the things I'm going to talk about, but I'm hoping that you will fill in the margins of this reflection with your own lives and experiences of this opaqueness, and then maybe be willing to say some of those, what you've written in the margins at the end. As John said, I've taught at CSBSJU for over 40 years. And when I look at the students who come into my classes every day, this is what I see. Most of them are white. Most of them are middle class or upper middle class. They're good looking. They're stylishly dressed with exactly the right number of holes in their jeans and the right kind of flip-flops. They're smart, hardworking, with supportive, sometimes hovering parents, and even with large, extended families. It's really tempting to see them as generic members of Generation Y or millennials or Generation Going Nowhere, which I heard them called recently. But it's terrible, I know, these labels. And the trouble is that these labels always blind us to the outliers, the people who don't fit the profile, and most importantly, they blind us to the part of every student that doesn't fit that profile. So what my book and all these years of teaching have taught me is that even the students who seem to fit that image without a single hitch carry burdens in their heavy backpacks, alongside of the $200 chemistry book and the Riverside Shakespeare and their workout clothes. And those burdens, I think, are secrets that are alive, but so muffled that even their best friends sometimes don't know about them. So what I would like to do is tell you two stories of students who had a hard time hiding their burdens. And I'm going to read them. They're short because I want to get the details right. The first one was about a student named Kristen. And here's how I saw her presence in our classroom. The young woman's pregnant belly swelled and swelled, filling the small seminar room in the library and pushing my students and me closer and closer to the walls as the semester and her pregnancy wore on. The creative writing class was half men, half women, all of them traditional age students, none of them parents, at least so far as I knew, and many of them oddly ignorant about pregnancy and childbirth, and reluctant even to say the words. At CSBSJU, pregnancy is something of a rarity, even among the faculty and staff. And among the 2,000 women students, maybe 2 or 3 a year bring the burden of an unborn child into the classroom, where they can't help but feel glaringly conspicuous. But Kristen came back to school after studying abroad in Greece, as a matter of fact, pregnant but determined to finish her senior year and have her baby. She came to love the baby, who appeared in her poems and stories as a little seahorse, fluttering inside her. She wrote about the hard decisions she faced, whether to keep the baby or put her up for adoption. Neither my students nor I could ignore Kristen or her burgeoning stomach, or the mix of joy and trouble she brought into our classroom. We read and talked about her poems and said the words out loud to each other: morning sickness, pregnant, baby, adoption. By the last day of class, we were saying labor pains and contractions, and wondering if we'd know what to do if the little seahorse decided to swim into the big ocean of the world a month early, and that in our classroom. it didn't happen, I'm pretty glad to say. So we couldn't ignore Kristen, nor could my students, nor could we ignore Hawa, who came to class every day last year wearing a long, colorful skirt and a hijab that completely covered her hair but swept back over her ears to reveal pretty earrings. At first, she planted herself in a far back corner of the room and said in a voice so soft we could hardly hear her that she and the surviving members of her family had come to central Minnesota to escape the Somali Civil War. As the semester went on and we read poems and stories that reminded Hawa of events in her life, she, like Kristen, seemed to grow. And then in poems and sometimes heated discussion, she found the words to tell us about her life, always on the run, from Somalia to Ethiopia to Kenya and finally to St. Cloud. She was a little girl when the masked soldiers wielding machine guns came to their home, wounding her mother and father and sending the family on a terrified flight. She was still a little girl, only 10, when her mother died giving birth to her 11th child, drenched in blood in the back seat of a car, trying to get to a distant doctor. The baby died soon after, and Hawa became the caretaker for her younger brothers and sisters, especially the 1-year-old. She carried him on her back to get water, an hour's walk each way every morning. She told us these stories without self-pity or self-righteousness, but with a quiet matter-of-factness that wouldn't let us look away. The burdens of memory she carries, like Kristen's growing baby, filled the classroom. And Hawa wrote a poem, and I've included it in our packet because I think it is so wonderful and so revealing, and it gave her a chance to put into words something that she hadn't had a chance to put into words yet. It's the one called Childhood Memory Poem. And by the way, she's writing this in English, her 4th language. It's kind of set up as a conversation. She says she was talking to her aunt, I believe. So we have Hawa's voice and then this questioning voice. I remember some guys. What guys? Guys whose faces were masks. They broke into the house. What house? Our house. They had guns. What guns? Machine guns. I remember no one moved. Lasad, Lasad, Il Jahab. Money, money and gold. I remember them saying. What money and gold? Our money and gold. I remember my mother as she wandered around the house. You remember that? I remember the shooting. Mother screamed, "Don't kill my son, don't kill him." Seeing the blood pour from my brother, she passed out. You remember that? I remember the killers living and smiling. I remember one naked face. That's, I think, a really wonderful poem. But as I said, even if they had been stone silent all semester, I don't think that Kristen and Hawa would have been able to hide the burdens of their lives. But what about the others? All those students who don't have a burgeoning belly or wear a hijab to give away their secrets. I think that I would never know my students' burdens of grief, anger, or secret joy, except that I'm lucky enough to teach writing and literature. And even the most innocuous, harmless, bland assignment seems to call forth revelations. I'm honestly not going fishing when I give an assignment. Sometimes I'll say something as simple as write something, and it always pulls something to the surface that I couldn't know about and wasn't really asking to know about, but there it is. And honestly, I could give you 100 examples, as anybody could in this room who is a teacher or a counselor or a listener of some other kind. But I'm going to just say a few about students who write about their personal or family burdens, but then also who write about the weight of our troubled world, which I think they also carry with them because that troubled world has invaded their lives as much as it has mine and ours. A couple years ago, I guess it was last year, I asked students to compile a poetry anthology of 10 to 15 poems that they liked or that spoke to them in some way. And then the assignment simply was, read the poem carefully and then write something about it. That's all I said. And here's some of the things that came out. In one anthology, buried in the dead center, was this line, this commentary on a poem. poem written by my friend helped me believe again that I'm worthwhile, even though my dad molested me. Quietly, that's all, and then moved on to the next poem. Or in another student's anthology, his commentary, these 10 war poems are an accurate picture of our past and present world. These bland assignments reveal kids who are gay and who are facing the terror and joy of acknowledging that discovery to themselves and then to someone else. Kids who endure the hidden injuries of race, ethnicity, and class, family breakdown, being bullied, called Igor and Watermelon Head. And then another one, the sickening way the earth falls out from under young people when they begin to doubt a deeply held religious belief or simply can no longer believe anything at all. And this might be a faith that supported them for the first 21 years of their lives and bound them perhaps to generations of their families, and now it's suddenly gone. And what do? I mean, we could cynically say, well, that's what college is for. And then we would be agreeing with the people who think President Obama wants people to go to college so they can use their faith. But that would be a terrible response to that kind of, I think it's a grief. At least I've heard it as a grief. But the other thing I've learned is that it isn't just sorrow or that kind of burden that we, not just our students, but all of us often hide inside of ourselves because it's dangerous not to. Sometimes our bodies camouflage forbidden joys, loves, and dreams. And I brought another poem, the one called What Makes Me. It's written by Connor Grill, who is a tackle on the St. John's football team. He's really big, and he has probably the biggest feet I've ever seen in my life, and he sort of shuffles into class every day. But he's also a poet, and he wrote this poem. What makes me? My heart pumps out blood 80 times a minute. It pumps out feelings even faster than that. My legs can squat over 400 pounds, no problem. They just as soon crumble under the weight that my pen carries. I stand head and shoulders above most people. My emotional stature could hardly be kicked out of a crowd. I can tackle full-grown men twice my size, only to get tackled by full-grown matters of unspeakable consequence. My wall boasts quotes from Ali, Gretzky, Lombardi, while shunning my favorites from Dickinson, Huntley, Baudelaire. I wear anklets with my Under Armour, mouth guards with my ponytail. I keep my jock strap with my diary, my musings with my protein shake. I'm a dumb jock. I'm an honor student. I'm a meathead whose head is in the clouds. I'm an athletic poet. I'm a poetic athlete, but not necessarily in that order, and never in the same room at once. So we just blew Connor's cover right there. And in this poem, for a moment, the selves are together, and the splits that he feels in himself and the necessity to be one or the other, but never both of them in the same room at the same time, I think is healed in the poem somehow. And I think those splits are much more common than we might like to believe, in our students and probably in ourselves as well. So students put these secrets, these silent words into my hands, and I, like many of you, have to figure out what to do with them. How can we look and listen to the cares of our students, or the cares of the world's children, and not be so overwhelmed that we hurry back to our comfort zone, which I think is one of the most horrible phrases in the English language and one that should be banished. Because it urges us to shut our eyes and our ears and slam the doors of our hermitages and our hearts. I've been hearing recently about, and I know this is not a new thing, but it got renewed for me recently, compassion fatigue. There was Krista Tippett has this program called On Being on Sunday mornings on NPR, and she interviewed Nicholas Kristof, who is an investigative reporter who goes all the way around the world and finds the stories that nobody else dares to tell. His talk was the interview was called The Limits of Human Empathy, Journalism and Compassion. he talked about the fact that neurologists and social psychologists have begun to study this phenomenon of compassion fatigue, and they've been testing people to see what the extent of our compassion is. And this is a quote which I can hardly believe, but I'm going to read it to you because it comes from one of these psychologists. The point at which we begin to show fatigue is when the number of victims reaches 2. The point at which we begin to show fatigue is when the number of victims reaches 2. That's not very many. Yes. So, I know that fatigue is real and flight is a real temptation, and I've certainly been tempted to both. But I'm reminded by some words that one of my nieces wrote. A few years ago, her father, who is my brother, and her baby were killed in a car accident. And and she was also in the accident, and she was injured. And in order to keep our family, informed about how she was and what was going on, and also to find a way to work through her grief, she started to keep a blog. And she wrote about what was going on in really wonderfully eloquent ways. And somehow or other, people picked up this blog out of the 90 million that are on the internet and began to read it and to respond to her and to begin to tell her stories of their own lost children, mostly. And after a while, maybe a year later, she was pregnant with her second child, and she was afraid, of course, that she would lose this baby too. And she wrote on her blog, "It's different now. So many of the people I have contact with lost a child, and their stories are part of me now. The fragility of life is always in my awareness. I'm not trying to hide from that reality anymore, and I guess there is some freedom in that. But some days, I really wish for the innocence of not knowing grief." And I think we all do. Sometimes you just want to wake up and not have grief staring you in the face, whether it comes from inside of you or from inside of somebody else, or from the world, the troubled world, sometimes troubled world, beautiful world, but troubled world that we all live in. But if compassion stops with 2, I wonder what happens to the third student who puts a secret burden in my hands disguised as an essay. If I've had my 2 for the day and I'm worn out, then what? I'm thinking that, now this is a very tentative idea, and it might be off the wall, but I'm thinking that compassion fatigue might be a little bit like white American guilt. There are some Americans who look back at the atrocities that happened during slavery and stints to African Americans a long time ago before any of us were alive, and they say, "I feel so guilty about that." And that seems noble at first, but the poet and social critic Adrienne Rich wrote an essay in which she called white guilt white solipsism, which means that all you're looking at is yourself and your emotions in the mirror, and you're not looking through the mirror to the people on the other side. You just keep seeing yourself reflected back to yourself, and your emotions become the center rather than somebody else. I don't know, something better than that. And what I've been thinking is that compassion fatigue is a little bit like that. It's a kind of solipsism that creates a hall of mirrors around us, where we can look out and we can say, "Oh gosh, I'm so tired. My feelings, I'm just so tired." And what I'm thinking is, though this might be really wrong, that our feelings are not the important thing. They're not the important thing. They can take us somewhere, but they aren't the center of anything, and they shouldn't be. And there should be a way to see through the mirrors to what's on the other side, which is the people who are in need of compassion. And if fatigue afflicts us when we learn the burdens and joys of individuals, students, or friends, or counselees, or whoever we're talking to, what happens when we face the vast sufferings of whole groups of people? They're the ones that brave journalists like Nicholas Kristof shine a light on, and that we might wish that he would leave in shadow. I think of the Irish. I think about the Irish a lot because I'm Irish, or half Irish, and very deeply influenced, I think, by the history of the famine Irish in the United States. And that's one of the pieces of research I did to write my book. And I learned about the English didn't really know the word compassion fatigue. I think that's a 20th or 21st century invention. But they certainly knew the feeling, and they certainly paid close attention to their own tender feelings. The potato famine struck first in 1845 when this horrible fungus destroyed the whole potato crop. And during that year, all the English newspapers were filled with stories about it. Oh, the poor starving Irish. By 1846, when the plague struck again, everybody was tired of it. And the evidence is in the newspapers. They said, this is the London Times, they said that they were tired of telling the tedious and wearisome 10 times told tale of the famine. And so they apologized to their middle-class English readers, saying, we can easily imagine that our readers are beginning to be a little tired of Ireland. If it is any consolation to them, or any apology for ourselves, we beg to assure them of a most entire sympathy with their fatigue. And then that fatigue became an excuse to do next to nothing to ease the suffering of the Irish. And subsequently, between 1 million and 1.5 million died either of starvation or sickness, or got on the coffin ships to come to the United States or Canada, and then either died on the way or died after they got here of a U.S. kind of poverty. So that's compassion fatigue pushed to the extreme. But I'm not sure but what, if we look there, I can see myself in that mirror. For I think of the African Americans who are only now learning the story of what their ancestors lived through after emancipation. There was a wonderful PBS documentary called Slavery by Another Name that told about the ways in which black people were almost always unjustly imprisoned and then put on chain gangs and left there for the rest of their lives because that was nice free labor and they could work them to death if they wanted to. And then, of course, the terrible fallout from that history. And I think, too, of the generations of immigrants who are still coming to the United States and to our schools. Every Hmong student, I think, carries the whole weight of the Vietnam War, just as Hawa carries the whole weight of the Somali Civil War. It's with her. It's with them all the time. So far as I know, neither the Irish nor the African Americans told their children about the secret anguish and shame they carried with them. They shut the eye of memory so that they could do the daily work of making a better life for their children. But as I learned from writing about my own family, secrets might hibernate, but they don't die. They're in there someplace. In responding to these troubles, these burdens, these joys that people bring to us, we can be coolly objective, but again, I think with disastrous results for ourselves and our students, or other people who entrust us with their troubles and joys and dreams. So what I prefer to do is to keep my eyes fixed on people who do not succumb to compassion fatigue, even though they have absolutely every reason to do so. One of the ones I really admire and think about a lot is Paul Farmer, who I'm sure some of you know about. The wonderful book, Mountains Beyond Mountains by Tracy Kidder, tells the story of the work of Paul Farmer and his organization, Partners in Health, in Haiti, and they've been there for at least 20 years. And you know what Haiti's like and what they face: poverty, corruption, AIDS, earthquake, cholera, the inefficiency of NGOs and all kinds of other organizations down there. And so you think that Paul Farmer would look away and say, yeah, I'm tired. He never does. He keeps going. And his organization keeps going with him. And they're doing remarkable things right this minute as we talk about it. I probably am not going to go to Haiti, but I keep thinking that I can help my students, because this is the thing I know how to do. Write about whatever is on their minds with skill and power, so that their writing becomes a gift to others and liberation for themselves. A writer I really admire is Tilly Olson. great human tasks is to spin out from the tight spiral of the cell. You can just feel that, spin out from the tight spiral of the cell. And I think that that can be what writing can help our students do. So I have one more story to read to you. And this is about a young woman named Carissa who was caught in that stifling spiral. And so, this is her story. A man she barely knew had raped Carissa when she was a high school junior. Like so many young women, she didn't tell a soul. She came to St. Ben's carrying that secret and edging closer and closer to suicide. An alert, compassionate FYS teacher walked her to the counseling office, and by the time she arrived in my writing class a couple years later, she was ready to put her experience on paper. Now, when a student puts something so raw into my hands, it's tempting to say to myself that I can't possibly grade it or ask her to revise something that took more courage to write than I'll ever have in my lifetime. But that reaction stops evolution and growth in its tracks. Instead, I think it's important to ask even the most personal writing, so what? And who cares? And why are you telling us this? And what's at stake for you and your readers? And then we need to help students, what I try to do, write their way to an answer. So, Carissa had turned in a draft, and I had asked her those questions. And the draft was about her struggle to forgive her rapist so that hatred would no longer be the center of her life. But as she pondered those essential writer's questions, she knew that she was writing for herself and to herself, but also to and for the many girls and women who were at that very moment struggling to forgive a rapist, the parents who couldn't protect them, the men who were all somehow responsible. Most important, she wanted those other girls and women to know that they didn't need to forgive themselves because they hadn't done anything wrong. Her completed essay was blunt and starkly honest, in tracing both her pain and hatred and her hard-won and still tentative forgiveness. She sent this essay to the battered women's shelter, Anna Maria's house in St. Cloud, asking them to give it to any woman who was struggling as she had. So I think, I don't know what it did for those women, but I know that for Carissa, it helped free her from a spiral that was strangling her, I think. So, I don't know where this takes us, but I think too, the words from Galatians, carry one another's burdens, and so you will fulfill the law of Christ. That seems to say that that's the whole law of Christ. It's the thing we're asked to do. Or Barbara Brown Taylor, who is on the top, who has a wonderful book called An Altar in the World, and I had a little quotation from her on the top of the third page of your handout. There will always be people who run from every kind of pain and suffering, just as there will always be religions that promise to put them to sleep. For those willing to stay awake, pain remains a reliable altar in the world, a place to discover that a life can be as full of meaning as it is of hurt. The two have never canceled themselves out, and I doubt they ever will, at least not until each of us, or all of us together, find the way through. One other, line, prayer, that sustains me when I think I can't do this anymore is the one that we Benedictines pray at every wake, at least in our place. We pray it at every vow ceremony and every renewal of vows. Sustain me, O Lord, as you have promised, and I shall live. Do not disappoint me in my hope. And it is the wonderful thing that prayer is. It lets you turn away for a minute and gather strength, and then you can turn back with the sustaining power of God behind you, or with you, or in you. And the other thing that sustains me is the prayer from the Talmud that's right underneath that. And I keep this by my desk, so I have to read it every day, because what it does is, I think, remind me of the modesty, humility, and comfort of knowing that while I and we can't do everything, we can each do something. So, Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obliged to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. So, I think that for me, writing my own work and teaching writing are my ways to face troubled times. And I know very well that all of them are difficult. And after some people who read my book, Going Blind, asked me what was the hardest part of writing that book. And I know a lot of them thought I was going to say all that dang research that I had to do. But that was the joyful part of it. I love doing research. But the hardest part was facing the pain of my family and my sisters and brother and going as deeply into it as I had to. But you come out the other side, I think, if you go all the way through. And so it's liberation, and it's that liberation of spinning out from some tight spiral that keeps you bound. So anyway, that's my way of looking at these things. And as I said, I always hope that people will write in the margins. And so if you've got some thoughts in the margins, I and the rest of us here would love to hear them. So thanks.
Can we reassemble and pull together for ongoing conversation and questions, observations? Please use a mic, and there are 3 of them. Okay. Yes, Bob, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The experience that was brought to mind for me was from my own family's story. About 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to visit my grandmother's hometown, and I'd been doing some, I connected with the History Museum there and asked to see if they had any materials on her family. I ran across a newspaper article that described how my great-great-grandmother was killed in a train accident, and it was horrific. And when I came back, I sat down with my grandmother, who was still living, and asked her about it, because I'd never heard about it. And she said, well, we never talked about it because it was so hard for my father, because it was his mother who was killed. And the more that we started talking, the more my grandmother started telling the family story. And all of a sudden, all sorts of things that had never quite made sense to me began to make sense, because I understood the pain underneath a lot of it. It really was an amazing, and I was really grateful that I was able to help my grandmother tell that story, because I think she needed to tell it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that sometimes the demands of everyday life, of simply surviving, demand that we keep the secrets from our, that we hide them away for sometimes a generation or two. But it seems really sad to me that we have to hide them away forever. So I'm glad you got to hear it.
Sister Mara, I'm just wondering, the candor and the openness of the students in response to the invitation is quite remarkable, I think. And obviously you must create an ambiance of trust and of respect, and give a kind of permission to say, look, you can go there if you wish. I'm just, do you know what I'm saying? I don't know.
I do. I wish I could say I knew how I did it. But one of the things I think about teaching is that if you know how you do it, you probably aren't doing it very well, because there are no rules or formulas for it. But I mean, this sounds really kind of naive or something, but my invitations are so unfishy. I know what I try to do. I try not to ask questions where I already know the answer. If I already know the answer, it's not a question. And so I try to always ask questions where I don't know the answer and where the students have something to tell me. And then the other thing I try to do when a student does put something like that in my hands, or when it comes out in the classroom, I try to acknowledge it, not to fix it. You know, that young woman who wrote that one poem healed her when she was feeling worthless because her father had molested her. There's no way I can fix that, but I could say, I heard that, and thank you for saying it. And sometimes that's all you need to do. I think that's all you need to do. I heard you. You know, another student, I mean, I have read every year some student writes about rape or sexual molestation. And she said that her dad had molested her from the time she was a little girl. And she said that still she wakes up every morning and wishes that her life were different. And I know that's true, and I absolutely know that I can't fix it, and neither can she. But to be able to say that, and then to write a bunch of poems and stories in which, in many veiled ways, she's able to tell that story, I just think it lifts some kind of burden. And I guess that's all I want to do. I know I'm not a psychologist. I know I'm not a counselor. I know I'm not going to know the professional things to say, but to say I heard you seems to be a healing thing.
It sure is.
I guess it just in response to that, I want to speak as a former student of Sister Mara's to the atmosphere of the classroom that I've experienced. And I actually had Mara for women's literature way back a few years ago, not way back actually, but and was in the class with my sister, my older sister, sort of an unusual situation, but just to, I guess, thank you and remembering the atmosphere of that classroom that certainly was open to personal experiences. And I know from others who have taken your classes that it's sort of an agreement that if you have something, Mara has a way of pulling it out of you without pulling at all. So it's sort of, I don't know, it's people who don't push tend to get all of the whatever's underneath that. But I remember in that class how we'd sit in this big circle and everyone would just pour their hearts out, and it was one of the most personal and academic experiences I think I had in all of college. So.
A wonderful class. One day, Maggie and her sister Leah, they always sat next to each other, and one day I asked them, the whole class, would you ever want to repeat your mother's life? And one of them said yes, and the other one said no. Almost in the same breath.
Hi, Sister Mara. My name is Justin. I'm a first-year Johnny here. And actually, you had one of my dad's best friends as a student back in the day. That's my little connection. But I was just wondering, going back to the compassion, fatigue, and apathy, as a first-year Johnny here, I'm also a member of the Bonner Leadership Program. And I see around me that there isn't a lot of apathy anymore. And I don't know if you can chalk it up to our generation or if it's gotten worse as the generations have gone on. But for my point of view, I want to try to help, and I want to get past the apathy and the compassion fatigue and look for the deeper story to see what we can do about them. And I'm wondering, from what do you think that we can do as a generation perhaps to possibly turn around the cycle that we have currently seen to be in, where there is a lessening of the compassion itself and then of being apathetic?
So you think that apathy is growing, compassion is fading away, and apathy is growing?
I see it in the halls of Mary too, I think, and I think unfortunately I do see it. And maybe I'm just not looking in the right places, but, and I know obviously there is a lot of good work being done. You mentioned Paul Farmer and all that he does, but on some of the more general level, it seems that maybe it is. I don't know.
Maybe people out
I
here
think
have
maybe everyone else who's here who has been on here longer than I have.
have responses to that. Well, I keep coming back to what Margaret Mead said. The only thing that has ever changed anything is a group of committed people who keep their eye on what it is they're doing. And I don't think you're ever going to change a whole generation or even a whole floor on Mary 2. I don't think so. I mean, I think that people have different whatever. But I think that if you can gather a small group around you and think about, that thing from the Talmud, you don't have to do everything, but everybody has to do something, and do something that matters to you, that is going to make a difference. That's a small answer. But, of course, for me, everything comes back to writing. I can't seem to help myself, but one of the things I say to my students every time they write an essay is, do you really believe what you're saying here? Do you care about it? And if I were to cancel this assignment, would you still want to do it? And they look at me and think, well, you got to be crazy. Nobody wants to write an essay. And if they say no, I say, well, you haven't got a subject yet. Toss that one and find one that you really care about. And it doesn't always work. And students know me and they swear that they're just they just love this argument that they're making, and they don't care about it at all. But almost always, sometime during the semester, every kid finds something that he or she really wants to say. And once you find that, this thing, I want to say it and I want to say it to another person, something happens, I think. It goes from thought to I want to give it to somebody else, and then, okay, what are the repercussions of that? And Katie, sitting back there, doesn't know this yet, but in our FYS, the last essay assignment for the year is going to be writing a This I Believe essay and then posting it to NPR, the NPR This I Believe, or the NPR This I Believe website. And so everybody's going to have to find something that they believe enough to put on National Public Radio, or at least potentially to put there in a nice, concise form. And so partly I think it is, Justin, how did you become a person who's not apathetic?
I like to thank actually my high school English teacher, who has, actually I've known her since I've been born basically. Her daughter and my dad were best friends from 6th grade through currently. And I thank Mrs. Lustry for all that she has done. And actually her sister lives in college. Caloran is her last name. I don't know her first name. But anyways, so I think Mrs. L, because every day she was the one who taught us to find what you love and write about it then. And I think that helped me to figure out what I do care about and then to write it down and bring it up, which I think is just being able to write about it and to share your thoughts. I think when we keep it to ourselves, I think that's it doesn't go anywhere. And so you need to share it however.
Yeah, I think you and I agree about that. That sounds
Good for me.
good. Yeah, thanks.
But thank you very much.
Yeah, but Pat, now you've worked in situations that would stop most of us in our tracks. Pat worked on a Native American reservation in western Minnesota, and she's a nurse practitioner and was in a clinic where people came in day after day after day with all kinds of, terrible situations. Pat, how did you keep from just giving up and saying, I'm too tired to do this?
one comment that occurred to me. I sometimes think it's not apathy, because I think people do feel. It's not an absence of feeling. It's more of a paralysis, and it's a paralysis, I think, that's caused by a growing recognition of just how complex certain situations are, and how you may be totally wrong and misinterpreting the situation. And then also a paralysis that's caused by the sense that I need to fix it, which is what you said, and knowing that we're not going to be able to fix it, and so we do nothing. But I think it's that combination of a kind of paralysis caused by recognition of complexity and a fear of making things worse and therefore not doing anything. But I think the feeling is there. It's not apathy so much.
Do you see a way to break through that?
Well, one of the things you said, by getting over the sense that we have to fix it.
Or that we have to fix everything, if we
Yeah.
can just do one thing.
Yeah.
And
But I
do it
mean,
with all
not,
our heart.
not even fix even one
Yeah.
thing, but just
Yeah.
to, because the fixing somehow is like bodies heal themselves. There's a natural resource, I think, physically. The body heals itself.
Mhm.
And I think in many ways healing comes from within.
Mhm.
It's not the outside person who manipulates things and makes it right.
Mhm.
I want to say thank you for a wonderful, wonderful